Good evening. Welcome, everybody, to our third episode of the Fires and Grading. I am beyond delighted to have you all join us here. I'm Don Smith. Along with the co-hosts, we have Garth Larson and Becky Pepler here.
Good evening, everyone.
Hello.
Yes. And in just a second, we have a special guest with us. We will get to our guests in just 1 second. Let's have them do a quick stare down as we're doing this. It's so that we're excited to have you here for the third episode of the Fires and Grading. In our last episode, we dug deep into it was part one of our accountability that we see in schools and accountability in grading, and we discussed how a lot of schools use grades potentially as a carrot or a stick. And we knew that there was such a big topic to talk about that we wanted to extend it to a part two where we talk about where do we see accountability within standards-based grading? Because one of the things that we hear from school to school to school is kids no longer are doing blank, fill in the blank for whatever it is, and we hear there's no accountability within standards-based grading. But as we thought about this topic and we thought, who do we want? We thought there'd be no one better than Rick Wormeli to join us for this episode. So we are beyond excited, Rick, to have you join us. And Garth and Becky, I just want to hear from you guys. Why did you also agree that Rick is the person to have join us for this episode?
Well, I can go first if that's okay, Becky. Well, I think it's one of these things, Don, where there's these titans out there in the assessment and grading conversation that have really paved the way for schools, not only in the U.S., but globally, to really think about reform, think about what we're doing in our schools in relation to communication of learning and supporting learning and feedback and differentiation and all these things. And anytime Becky and I are out, or I know Don when you're out, when we're talking with groups and we're asking, all right, what are some different books you've read, or who are some people that you follow? Every single time Rick Wormeli's name comes up. And I think it's just because of the plethora of resources that Rick has put out there in the world of education. And this goes just beyond standards-based grading, in the world of education that helps educators get better. And I want to take it one step further, which is I know personally the first time I got my hands on the book, Fair Isn't Always Equal, it really opened my mind up to what assessment and grading and classroom structures and communication can look like to really identify how we're best supporting every single kid that walks into our buildings. And I've been fortunate enough years ago when I was in a director role, after I got a chance to kind of get to know Rick a little bit, Rick came into our district, spoke to everybody. And the one thing I will just say about Rick, and then Becky can add her thoughts on this, is the word genuine. There isn't a person out there in education that is as genuine as Rick Wormeli around trying to work with people to do the right thing. And so when we talk about accountability, which is there's a lot of information and thoughts and maybe different views on what accountability looks like in education. And so that's why I think he's the perfect. Becky, I know you'll probably bring a whole nother level from your classroom experience learning from Rick.
Yeah, that's really like Rick in my mind has been a trailblazer in this work and reshaping how we think about assessment and grading, but also in what's doing best, like doing what's best for kids. And for me, it goes back to thinking about attending a conference, Rick. This is one in Wisconsin. I can't remember. I think it was in Appleton, Wisconsin, where we had gone to it. And honestly, that moment for me was an incredibly transformational moment in my career because when I left the conference that day, I really left thinking that Rick really pushed me to think differently. And I think to challenge the status quo as to what I knew assessment and grading looks like in my own classroom. And I know he's done that for others too. And the other piece that I think brings an absolute value to bringing Rick on for this particular episode is I love how he also talks about how we courageously have these conversations and how we lead these conversations. And I know I've found incredible value from hearing Rick in so many different capacities. And I think he's just the perfect person to continue this conversation around accountability with us tonight.
Wow. I'm going to have good dreams tonight. Thank you for saying that. That really means a lot. As you guys know from all your writing and your planning, you don't often get to hear what is the impact, what is the testimonial and how is it perceived and what filters are in there, what came of it. So that means a lot. It means that, oh no, now I have to live up to the promise when I write the next thing.
Rick, I have a quick question for you. I think everybody knows a lot of your educational accolades and the work you do, but what's something you want anybody joining live or listening after this, like what do you want them to know about Rick as a person?
Oh, I'm a relatively new grandpa.
Wow, fantastic!
They're 2 and 4, and we have a third one on the way.
Wow, congratulations!
Congratulations.
So that's lighting me up, and I don't know. Thank you, Jenny, for posting. Congratulations. I was in the classroom to just underneath 25 years, and then I'm in schools almost every week. Working side by side with teachers, and then doing conferences and writing and doing articles in a variety of areas. And I guess as an educator, I've taught 5 different core subjects at the secondary level. Plus, I had to be. I was in the very first group to be nationally board certified for the National Board for Professional Teaching Standards. And I did the one where you had to integrate fine and performing arts. So that's a huge part of my classroom approach. Like when I taught English, you'd walk in there and you wouldn't know what subject it was because there's science and music and art and mathematics and engineering all over my walls, and history and everything else and multiple cultures, because English is the way you come to know all those other subjects. Even though we were doing reading, writing, speaking, listening, viewing, vocabulary acquisition, rhetorical analysis, and other things in the class, we would always do it through the context or motif of those other subjects. We were teaching English that way. So I guess I really come from a place of being very interested in subject integration and connection, which is really going from sense making, the basic subject, to meaning making, to make the connections and resonate. So I don't know. I have 2 kids, and I'm right outside Washington, D.C., where morale isn't at its highest point right now as we record this session.
Well, Rick, thank you for sharing that, and congratulations on the grandpa. And I think that's definitely beyond exciting, to say the least. And it's in a small world, I just learned myself as well that, Becky, I was at the same event in Appleton where I get to see you, Rick, for the first time as well.
Oh my gosh!
I mean, that's kind of crazy that Garth, you were there, right? So
I was there, absolutely.
I can't remember what year. It was a while ago. I can't remember. I was trying to think in my head when it was.
I'm gonna say right around like 2014.
Yeah,
that's what I was gonna say. 2014, 15.
The beginning, the earthquake that happened that day.
Yes.
Yes. Was an inclusion of the sun as well.
And speaking of earthquakes, Rick, I was inches from where you actually stood for the 2 days, because it was a 2-day event, and I was inches from where you were. So you didn't know it, but I could have grabbed you the whole time. I was the person in the front row. So yeah, I was right there.
You were the one catching the spittle when I was particularly great with
They actually, his colleagues had to duct tape his hands behind his back, actually.
Yes.
So.
Jenny's comment there, Don just beat your super fan status.
Yep. Yeah. So I was right there. So yeah. So I want to kind of go off a little bit of our flow here. We were just kind of chatting with Rick before we had a chance to go live. Rick, you mentioned you had a chance to hear our last episode, and there's a couple of things. I just want to, is there anything that's just hot from when you watched the last episode that you're like, I want to share this or talk about this? Is there just 1 or 2 things that you just want to share with us right off the top of your head, or even argue with us? We want a little bit of banter too, like throw something at us, challenge it, connected to our last
very
episode.
Much. I used to think, but now I think.
Yes.
And I'm going to change my thinking in light of new perspective. Yeah, we'll try our very best. There were 2 things that you guys kept circling around and talking about, and I kept going, but what about? And then I realized, of course, it was a recording, and I couldn't really say anything or jump in at the time. 2 things, though, I'll just do, and then I'll back off of this, and we'll go on with today's topic, even though this is really dovetailing with today's topic very nicely. One of the phrases I like to use is that, grades are communication, not compensation. But that includes they're not validation, they're not reward, and they're not payment of some sort. And the larger umbrella for a lot of that is teachers make grades transactional. And it's the idea of a transaction conducted between teacher and student, the bartering. If you do this and give it to me, I will give you a 3.0. But if you do this, I'll give you a 4.0. We're exchanging goods. Or the teachers who keep using just the semantics that promote it as a transaction. The student says, you gave me an F. And I say, no, I didn't give you an F. You earned it. That's still grade as transaction. It's like somehow currency. And that destroys. You can't do that at the same time you try to make grades accurate communication, because you're conflating the 2, and it limits the capacity for either one to work independently and become accurate and have that integrity. So the idea of teachers auditing their practices in terms of, is this creating a transaction between us? might be the place that would open the door and go, oh, wait, I was making it transactional rather than making it communicative of some sort, like a disease, communicative. But as a part of that, and you guys kind of you snaked through this quite a bit, you kept talking about, accountability and all that means. And what does that entail? How do you hold them accountable? Was the perennial question that all of you are saying when you work with teachers that it's asked. And I asked that too early in my career, and I find the same experience you guys are citing. That was very authentic, very real for what I've experienced in North America and abroad. It's been very true. But just one or two thoughts on that. One is that accountability is actually mutual ethos. I'm looking out for you and your job as a student, as you are looking out for me, and my job as your teacher. I need to be the best teacher for you I can be. You need me to be good. And your job is to help me be good for you. And my job is to help you be the best student you can do. And we enter into this mutual benefiting relationship. I'm looking out for you as much as you're looking out for me. So accountability changes its tenor. Accountability is not a 4-letter word, literally or figuratively. And what I find is when a teacher screams out foul, if I don't count homework, at least some percentage, 10, 20%, they won't think it means anything. Or if I use a quiz as a just progress check, then it doesn't really count. It's just a check for learning progression towards a standard or proficiency in something. Then the kids won't give it credibility. They won't study for it. They won't care about it. And I can't teach responsibility, self-discipline, respect for deadlines, all those other things. Every time that happens, I'm going to suggest that that's really, and you should put it in subtitles below the teacher, I don't think it's fear of change. At one point, Garth had said that. I think teachers don't mind change. Honestly, I don't think they do. I think they like freshness, newness, and things. But as Peter Seng said, they don't want to be changed. And so they need to really own that. And if we're going to be helpful as a coach or a principal or a colleague, we have to ask the questions to get them to arrive at that discovery rather than saying, here's what you're going to do because it's all right. Because they won't own it because they're being changed. And they're giving it, the autonomy. And where I think a lot of that comes from, this idea of I don't want to go through that change or be changed, is I really don't think in most schools of teacher ed, and please correct me if anybody listening knows better, in most schools, not all, but in most schools of teacher ed, hoping teachers have had a background in teacher ed before they go in the classroom, it's not always a given case, there is not a year-long course in how do I motivate adolescents, young adolescents, and children. How do I actually create and maintain a focus on executive function and build those skills? For example, I find that teachers who are very, very good at executive function, they really get into it, the requests for redos and retakes, or what I call relearning, reassessing, so are mindful of the role they play, goes way down because they begin to use their time wisely. They know how to study. So if you have a high school teacher who's really struggling with, these kids don't care, they don't take responsibility, they don't engage, I'm going to say, have you overtly taught and helped them cultivate executive function skills? Let me list those skills for you. A part of it is starting things on the day it was assigned, not 5 weeks later, the night before it was due. And time management, working backwards. If something's due Friday, what are you going to have to do on Thursday so you return on Friday? What are you going to do on Wednesday so you can do the stuff on Thursday so you return on Friday? Working backwards and stuff. How do I do stuff when my heart is not in it, yet I still know it's coming up? There's some adults who need to learn that too, but it's mostly high school, middle school, and elementary. When I overtly and I go out and study what we know about motivation and building self-discipline, respect for deadlines, executive function, get your act together. When I overtly teach that, I don't have to rely on grades as a form of coercion, bribery, or classroom management. And what I feel like is lacking from their hands, we're not putting those practical tips in their hands. So as I'm thinking about working with others who are struggling with that and pushing back with that very real, very authentic, very legit concern, that means that if I'm taking something away from them, I must replace it with something of equal or greater practicality, or they won't find the new grading principles credible. And so I must at every turn put those tools in their hands, because basically that's all they've got. If they have no training in it, in motivation and all the stuff that engages, and kids care about school and they show up, and attendance or lack of absenteeism drops, attendance rises. Well, I need to give them the tools to make that happen other than the grading stuff. So I do think that they probably would be very open to change, but they lack the large instructional repertoire and the assessment literacy repertoire to make that happen. So it comes across as a bit threatening. It's out of their wheelhouse. They don't have any other options, and they can get defensive really fast. And just a reminder that, the way you grade is one of the clearest revelations of your core values, your bottom line philosophy as a teacher. I can look at somebody's grading policy newsletter they send out to parents and kids, or their syllabus, and I can tell how they talk with children in the class, pretty much how they conduct their lessons, how they set things up, their whole philosophy, just from the colors revealed, the core values revealed through their grading concepts, their grading policies. And so nerves are raw, because I'm asking you in a way to change your very identity as a teacher, to let go of this while you reach for that. And that can be very scary. But if I don't put these other things in their hands, then they have nowhere else to go. And of course, irritation or frustration rises up. Anyway, I was thinking that as I watched you. So, response, comments?
Yeah, Garth, Becky, I'm just going to jump. Like, I have like 3 things I wrote down already. And I think the last one where you said we have to give them the tools to be able to do that, like in the place of grades, I think it leads into a lot of our conversation tonight for sure. But Garth or Becky, is there anything you wanted to jump on or respond to that Rick said? I have a lot, Rick, and just, I caught myself listening and forgetting we're running a show for a second there. Just,
Yes.
Yeah.
Go ahead, Becky.
Yeah, I was captivated too. I love how you referred to that about the change, like not that they're afraid of change, but of being changed. That really struck me. And I also think the piece, that ties into the conversation around clarity, and when we do have that layer of accountability, I think that also comes when we are clear about what our expectations are and what students are responsible for learning and who is responsible for what. What is my responsibility as a teacher versus what is your responsibility as a student? And I think so often we just assume that that's known, especially in our upper grade levels. I think in my high school classroom, like I assume sometimes that was known. So I love when you're saying about the ethos and like this, what is your responsibility versus my responsibility? I think that clarity component ties into that so well as well. Like that strengthens that understanding.
And I think too that, and particularly in high school and middle school, there's an overdependence and the need for external validation. Like with
Correct.
social media, if I post something and I don't get a lot of likes, I enter a depressed state. And for a lot of high school and middle school kids, if I have a high grade, I'm a good person. If I have a low grade or low score, I'm a bad person. My values in relation to my grade, and it's a sickness, really. It's a mental health issue. And it can send, we have this huge tsunami of anxiety, panic disorder, depression, suicide ideation happening across the nation. And I'm not kidding when I say tsunami. It's really been on the rise since 2018, 2019, and then it just really huge after COVID and all this stuff. And I think that one of the things you do as you're trying to say, okay, I'm responsible for various things, that I'm now going to do a lot more in my class with students self-monitoring. So they're in charge of seeing their progression going there rather than waiting for somebody from on high, like a teacher, to arbitrate where they are. So we're making the kids active, not passive, through, as was mentioned earlier, the feedback, descriptive, actionable feedback. I own my learning a lot more, and I don't deflect. I don't make excuses. I shed the skin of learned helplessness when I'm in charge of my learning and I care about it. And when I do that, when the teacher actually creates those opportunities, I'm more invested in the success of my teacher and of myself as we do that. But pulling kids away from that need of external validation and the dopamine rush that comes from that is a hard task. Very true. I understand that. Yeah.
Garth, did you have anything you wanted to add on?
I think, everything that all of you are hitting on. One thing that I think is a really good continual talking point, because we'll often say, similar to you, Rick, about trying to shift the thinking of grades being forms of compensation to communication. But I know personally, one thing I don't talk enough about is that transactional thinking there, that it is a transaction that occurs. So I think we get them there sometimes to say, no, really the purpose behind this is just to give accurate, honest, reliable, meaningful communication. But in their minds, they'll still see it as there is this transaction that occurs, even once they've started to shift their mindset more toward a proficiency-based system. There's still to a degree, there's that transaction of a proficiency score now instead of a percentage-based score. And so I think that's just helpful for me to think about. How do we continue to help them see it differently moving away from that to just helping them understand this is one of many forms of communication for students and for their caregivers on where they are in their learning journey.
That really makes me think, proficiency scales are a story of progression revealed. So the idea that the student would know how to go from a 1 to a 2, a 2 to a 3, a 3 to a 4 in any scale, not just, I don't know, my teacher hates me, that's why I got a 1 instead of a 2, or something like that. But the idea that I will create descriptors that are discernibly different between the level above and the level below, so I can see and mark my own progression, through that. And I own my story just a little bit more. And it makes it less of a transaction and more of where am I in a progression. Now that also means, because it's connected there, that we have to get kids and teachers to see what grades are. They're just a summative judgment of evidence presented as of one arbitrary calendar date. And so what does that mean? It's an encapsulation, a summative judgment at one moment in time. This is a momentary status on a continuum. So given subsequent evidence, the grades can change. So it's a transaction, but it's not a permanent status. It is a very tentative status. And we have grade books that are cumulative for the whole year as we go through that. And I think that the thing that teachers forget, and every federal and state agency in the United States and every legal body in the United States, what is a report card? It's the transcript. It's not the thing you send out every 9 weeks or every semester, quarter, semester, trimester, whatever it might be. Those are progress reports. And so I have this whole year to work on it, and it's just ludicrous. It goes against everything in human psychology for you to say, you have this 9 weeks to learn this, or sucks to be you. We're moving on, And so I'm not going to be, and I don't want any teacher to be beholden to a uniform timeline. So the really most effective teachers will shorten or lengthen timelines or support whatever. The basic idea is I have to get you there by the end of the year. But then I find more high schools, middle schools, elementary schools also doing and digital portfolios that follow the kids. So here's your science portfolio through high school, or here's your world language, oral language through elementary, or your coding, or your PE portfolio, or your English ELA portfolio through elementary. And then here's the one for middle school. And whatever summer or year you learn it, you get the credit for it as we go through that. Just the idea that, yes, if it's going to be this transaction, it can be a subsequent transaction down the road, but try not to make it transactional. Try to make a grade mean temporary status. You were here when I called it out on this one moment in time, but you could be here if you wanted to do that. It's not going to be held against you in perpetuity.
I love the idea of temporary status.
Yeah, I agree. And that alone is a tagline I'm jumping on and using. Just so you know, Rick, your entire section on transactions in the beginning when you first started talking, I'm going to go back and rewatch that because the way you said that, I think was absolutely fantastic. And I know I will be going back to I'm like, I need to rewatch that to be able to say, I like it. You did really well.
A lot of people use that and audit their practices in light of just that sentiment. They fundamentally change a lot of what they do. Because the goal, of course, as you guys have outlined so beautifully and compellingly, that grades are about accurate, clear communication. And, a fun thing to do with a lot of teachers is have a T chart, and on one side, what are all your grading practices? Like, what do you think about extra credit? What do you think about 4.0 versus 100.0? What do you think about, zeros suddenly turned into minimum Fs of 50? What do you believe about redos and retakes? Everything. What do you think at Amy's? But put it in one of two columns. Things that make a grade accurate, things that make a grade less accurate. And it's really uncomfortable how many items are in that column. And I just talked with my friends and colleagues about, I think grades are accurate. They're totally accurate. You can trust them to make a high stakes decision. No, you can't, unless you're doubling down to make sure the grades are truly accurate for the decisions that are about to be made.
That's fantastic. I'm like, that's a great activity, you guys.
Yes.
If any of you listening haven't done that, make the T-chart with things that make our grades accurate. And Rick, that could be a whole spin-off episode right there. Just, as we continue on, I want to just jump into
February of 2028 ready.
Yeah. But in reality, though, that's where we feel like accountability is such a hot potential fire, right? And we need to light a fire at times, and other times, like we need to say, like, is that an misplaced fire, right? So that's kind of also the first episode of like people like to blame standards-based grading for accountability issues, but in reality, it's not always the case. So as we continue to move on and just thinking about it a little bit, one of the things we often hear is that when standards-based grading is put into place, accountability is no longer there, right? So I just want to hear for a second from Becky. You're the someone who worked through this in the classroom as a teacher, right? I personally did not. I want to hear from you. What was that like? What did you see in your classroom's evolution over time? Like from when you first started in terms of accountability towards the end, did it increase or decrease? Because I think one thing we'll say overall is as schools get further down this and they refine their practices, we do see an increase in accountability. So Becky, I was just kind of curious, what did you hear? What did you see in your own classroom?
Yeah, I would definitely agree with that I definitely saw an increase in accountability over time. I think as you make any changes or implement anything that's new, obviously you have that implementation time period where, as teacher, I felt like it took time for me to get used to the change, but I also had to recognize that it took time for my students and their families to get used to what that change is and what that meant or how that looked different for them. But for me, from the accountability lens, from the improvement of that, I would think the thing that stands out to me to most as a teacher was how students became accountable for their own learning. And I alluded to it just a little bit before as Rick was talking too, but how kids talked about their learning to me was one of the most amazing changes that I saw in my own classroom. But I also heard from my own kids who had gone through a system like that and how they were coming home and talking about their learning. And, and it went from conversations to kids around, what can I do to earn more points, right? There's that transactional piece. That's what's in their mindset. To saying things like, I don't know anything from chapter 5 because I just had this percentage score that was slapped on top of my assessment that covered all these really important things, to kids starting to ask, can I come in for help on writing chemical formulas and naming compounds? And that shift for me as a teacher from that chasing points to really this mindset of chasing learning was so incredibly powerful. And to me, that was a huge level of accountability, right? They began taking ownership because they actually knew what was needed, right? That clarity, as I kind of mentioned before, was there, and kids could articulate that. And, I had kids who never before were asking for help showing up for reteaching sessions or coming in for reassessments, not because I made them do it. It was a high school class. I didn't force them. I was teaching mostly juniors and seniors, but because they wanted to improve their understanding and they knew what they needed to be able to do that. And I think that level of accountability within their learning was my biggest takeaway. Like if I reflect back in the classroom of going through all these changes to standards-based grading. But I also just want to add on a little bit to where I mentioned before, I saw that in my own kids too. So my kids went through a system that was standards-based. And I remember specifically a conversation with my daughter when she was in 4th grade and they had taken a math assessment and she came home. I'm like, okay, how did you do on your math? She had gotten it back. I'm like, how did you do on your math assessment? And 4th grade, right? She looked at me, she said, well, Mom, I know how to add fractions, but I don't know how to subtract fractions. And if we weren't clear in that learning about here are the goals that you're being assessed on, and we just said, here's your assessment on fractions, we wouldn't have that ownership. We wouldn't have that accountability for our students because they wouldn't know how to speak about their learning. And to me, that level of accountability is greater than anything that I could have imagined as a positive as a classroom teacher.
That's absolutely, I hear the story too about the 4th grader, your own child saying that. It's just mind-blowing there. Rick and Garth, any feedback or thoughts as Becky was kind of telling her story and things you're seeing too?
Well, I was thinking about a couple of things. That happened in 4th grade, and it happens in all the other grade levels. I've had any experience and visited classes or in my class when you disaggregate. Less curriculum per symbol makes that symbol more valid, more helpful. So you would literally write standards on tests and things, and the kids get separate scores, and they can. That's a story revealed. I often ask the teachers, prove to me your assessment is revelatory, and the mnemonic is reveal story, revelatory. There's a fun little phrase.
But I like that.
What that means is, this kid got scores like this. This kid got scores like this. This kid got scores like this, but one really low, and they might all average out to the same thing, which obscures the truth. It blocks it because you averaged. But if you have them separated out, I will actually change, because if I'm a conscientious teacher, I'll change my response to students. I'll do different feedback. I'll do different instructional design based on the story revealed. So assessment design is a literacy that is not out there widely spread. How do I design test items? How do I know that what I'm doing is truly evidentiary for the evaluative criteria we've identified? What are the look-fors? All of that stuff. And so that's a skill set we develop. We develop those evidence, but then I have to design my tests where these questions provide evidence for that standard, and these questions provide evidence for that, and that could be color coded, or it could have a little code and a key, and the key's at the top of the page or something, and down below there's a little symbol. This is standard, 21A through C and part of K. If you need to do that, whatever it might be. But disaggregation is to do that. I switched to standards-based grading and redos and retakes and all that stuff, not grading homework, but providing lots of feedback on it, which creates accountability, by the way. Kids will still do homework even though it's not graded. So we can talk about that sometime if you like. But I went to levels above me because I was really afraid that the students that those people had after having me the year prior, the kids would be overly dependent on redos. They would be like, oh, I need all this stuff provided for me. And to a T, every teacher said, oh no, I know which ones are the Wormeli students. Because we would have a lot of teachers at every grade level. So I was like, can you tell which ones came through me as opposed to the other three in that grade level teaching the same thing? And he said, I know the Wormeli students. And I go, oh no, do they not know the science or the math or the government or whatever it was I was teaching? And he said, no, they know their stuff. Thank you for all your hard work. And I was like, oh, okay. Well, then what's different? Your kids are unusually independent. And they come to me early on when they're not learning something and they're not floundering and they're worried about that. They also own all their decisions. If they do well, they describe what they did in order to be prepared for the test. If they do poorly, they describe the decisions they made that led to a poor performance. They own that. And then they always provide an action plan of relearning when they ask for a redo, because they know that you're not going to keep weighing the cow hoping for a different weight, each time. That I'm not just going to do, oh, I know my mistakes. I figured out, can I study at lunch and retake the test? There's always a plan of relearning before the reassessing. But there's a sense of hope in that. But it's also in that hope and not despair, unrecoverability, there's a sense of maturation. And what I find is if you want kids to be mature and learn self-discipline, they have to go through that process of relearning something and using their time differently, because obviously what they did before did not work, if they do poorly on a project or a test. And it's way more work. And what they do is they learn how to study correctly the first time. In fact, they turn to each other and say, whatever you do, don't have to do a redo for Mr. Wormeli. It's not worth it. Just do well the first time. But imagine me falsely assuming, as so many teachers do, because I did this early in my career too, that the F or the 0 did the teaching for me. Yeah. That'll teach you to learn your time wisely, respect deadlines, and bring your supplies in a timely manner. All those different things. It doesn't teach at all. Grades are terrible teachers in that regard. What does it is to recover from the mistake. So a place of hope where I'm very demanding and in their face, and I'm going to not let them escape the burden of their learning. As Garth was talking about in the last episode, they get to give up on their learning. They don't have to learn the stuff. Like, no. You're going to get on the bike and ride it again and again and again until you learn it and stop crashing into the rhododendrons. That's fine. But that leads to the maturity and the self-discipline way more than a permanent unrecoverable 0 could do it. So it's the recoverability from the mistake, not the label of the mistake, that does the maturing of the students. And it also the teacher not abdicating their adult role. My role is to get in your face and save you from yourself. And it might be something that sounds soft at first, but is way more demanding because it comes from a place of hope, or I might do this. You seem to have lost your way. How can we get you back on track? How can I help? And the idea that they would have to do the regular curriculum, but go back and do a previous curriculum is not, oh, look at me, I got a gift. It's actually really hard work. And a lot of kids mature and they get to the point of, I'm going to have to learn this sooner or later. I might as well do it now and have a happier life. But imagine the kid, instead of saying, if I got 4 more problems right, I could have a B. Or if I did all these things like brought in extra bottles of Purell, I could get extra points to get my grade up. Or clean out the fish tank. Things that are not really indicative of the evidence we claim to be reporting via our grades. So if I'm talking about, if I understand this, I've got mitosis, but I keep confusing it with meiosis. And so I really need to separate those two and spend some time. That's teacher gold and student maturation gold, just like Becky was describing. Now, this is my initial response. Garth?
Well, I mean, my mind's going in a lot of different directions right now, but something that I think with this, when we're kind of bringing in the accountability piece to relearning, reassessing, recovering from that. And those of you that have had it, that if you're watching or if you've heard me tell this story, and I'm not going to tell the full story, but this whole summary of accountability to learning, for me, the culmination in our district was during a graduation speech. Our students have been through a lot of change within assessment and grading, and the group that got up, because we have multiple students that give the valedictorian speech together, got up and said, for this year's valedictorian speech, we're going to look at life through the lens of a retake. And now, I will be honest, I was panicking in the back of the field house because I'm like, where is this going to go? Is this going to... And because at that time, we were in the midst of it, so there was a lot of people that weren't quite on board with the changes we were making. And the first student that spoke, she said, look, what we're doing with redos, retakes, reassessment is exactly what life is all about. She said, in life, we're going to fail over and over and over again. And the accountability to the failure is learning how to recover from it, learning how to be better as a result. What are the steps that we're willing to take to get better at what we do in our jobs or get better at what we do in our marriages? And she gave all of these great examples of where failure is going to exist. Like it's a guarantee that we're going to fail in life in different things. And this has helped us prepare for what that is like. So to Becky's point, and Rick, you said this earlier too, like it's actually increasing the accountability because we're teaching them accountability in all measures of how they function as human beings and what they do as a result. And I'll, people that have heard me tell this story, like by the end, I'm full of tears because I'm so excited because the kids really understood what it was. And that was the ultimate compliment to the work that our teachers were doing and that the experiences they were taking them through because they understood why we were going through this process and helping them become, more, have that self-ownership in their own learning. So I think it's a really great way of taking a little bof a different spin on the accountability, because sometimes we go straight to the accountability if they're missing deadlines and those types of things. But this is, like, in my opinion, one of the most important reasons why they do this is just that accountability to themselves.
You just gave one of the proofs that is so powerful that we can use when people are a little bit disparaging, standards-based grading. It is far more preparatory for the post-high school world. Mm-hmm. Let me show you how. Every single discipline, every profession out there, how'd you get good at it? Reiteration over with critique in between and more reiteration over and over. Nurses running irrigation lines, if you're in a farming community or agricultural community, lawyers, accountants working in the pharmacy, whatever it happens to be, it was reiteration. It wasn't one and done.
Right.
And that's incredibly powerful. If anybody says, how is this really preparing them for college or career training, and all that stuff, like, oh my gosh, let me count the ways. I can't not count the ways. And traditional grading would not do that as they were stepping forward to do that. I just thank you. That's a wonderful story. I wish I could hear the whole thing and see you cry. That'd be great.
Oh, I go into deep detail, Rick, about looking for a new job in the middle of graduation. It's fantastic.
Yeah, that's great.
So as we're hitting now, we had about 20 minutes left with us, and I want to let's jump to the solution. So I'm going to kind of throw out a question for each of you and have each of you kind of answer it in a way. So Garth, I would love to hear from you. You heard both Rick and Becky's story there, and your story about the graduation of like, that's how we get there. But we know sometimes it's a rocky path to get there. So Garth, the question in a second I'll have you answer is, what things are you seeing of schools that are putting in place policy-wise that can also hold students accountable? Becky, I'd like to hear from you, because where we say the consequence, Rick, we always quote you with this, of the consequence for not doing the work is doing the work. I think all of us use your line. I can actually hear your voice in my head when I say that. But Becky, I'd love to hear, what does that really mean in schools as well? Rick, I'd like to hear from you too. But Becky, I'd like to hear what practices are you seeing in terms of whether it's holding kids accountable for doing the work throughout. And then Rick, I'd really love us to dig into a little bit more on what is it you teach teachers? You said there's skills they're lacking. So I'd love to hear a lot more about that. If we have about 5 minutes as we hear from Garth, then Becky, then you. Like you say, because right now their grades are what they are comfortable, they're used to using. So what are those? Let's dig a little bit more on some of those executive functioning skills that you kind of talked about before. You teach the teachers kind of like, in order to have something besides the grade, which I think is really interesting. Garth, if you wouldn't mind going first.
Well, I think one of the biggest movements that are taking place as schools are working through this process of implementing standards-based learning practices, assessment, grading, et cetera. And going back to what we talked about a little bit earlier, making sure that the grades that we communicate to our students and their caregivers are of the most accurate, honest, reliable, meaningful forms of communication, is this idea of the separation of academic outcomes and where we want to see kids go, but also learner outcomes in terms of learner behaviors. And I'll give you an example of this. A district that Becky and I have been working with quite frequently out in California the last just over a year and a half now. They did this fantastic work in their district where they brought community members in and the board of trustees and admin and teachers, and they created this unbelievable graphic of this, what they call their vision of a graduate. You hear a lot of schools talk about profile of a graduate, vision of a learner, et cetera. And as I was looking at that, as we started doing this work, and they're in the process of separating academic outcomes from learner behavior outcomes, but as I looked at that graphic of what they really were trying to cultivate as learners, there were so many things to being good human beings. And so when we start to kind of look at what we want to communicate with students, caregivers, et cetera, is we have to have something in place, in our opinion, that showcases and communicates both things. Because I will say, Becky talked about her kids and my kids are in a standards-based system. They have a separation. There's communication around academic achievement, and then there's communication around learner behavior and how they engage in the learning process. And I will tell you, as a parent, I care way more about that on the forefront of how are they engaging in the learning process than I do on the academic outcomes. Because the reality is, if they're doing those things, if they're being accountable to their learning, if they're meeting deadlines, if they're being collaborative and cooperative with others, those things that we want to see in good human beings, if they're doing those things and they're not there quite yet academically, I'm okay with that because I know they're going through that progression. They're doing the things that we ask them to do. So I would say one of the first things that schools are really doing, Don, that we see, and a lot of the great thought leaders really talk explicitly about this, making sure that you have those separations, but is that they say, okay, they work really hard on identifying the academic outcomes in each of those courses and each of those grade levels, but they equally try to define what does it mean to be a really good learner. And so that's where you see, again, as I mentioned, things like, giving, Rick mentioned like the students in his class, like it's way better to give that effort the first time around, right? That's a learner behavior. That's something that we want to communicate. How are they doing in those? Are they being academically honest in what they're producing? All these things that we've often shifted over to a way to hold students accountable on the academic grade. No, we want to be able to communicate those things because those are important. The last thing I'll say, because I know I'm at the end of my time here, Don, is as from my lens, as we've talked with community members, as we've talked with the business community, as schools are going through those changes, they care about these. These are the things they want kids held accountable to because these are the skills they need when they're out there representing their companies in the general public. These are what we need to see, in terms of time management skills and executive functioning, as Rick mentioned. So I would say the first thing is just making sure that we're crystal clear on what are those academic outcomes that we're striving to make sure that we support and help every kid get to, but equally important, what are some of those functional behaviors that we want to see in our students, and how do we communicate those things as well?
Garth, I just want to push a little bit, though, and have you go a little bit deeper on how do you see folks add teeth to that? Because we work with a lot of schools, and they say, well, we did that, and the kids didn't care about it. But in reality, I think a lot of the adults in the building actually didn't care about it. Maybe they didn't buy into it. So then what are you also seeing? How are folks adding teeth to that?
So I think there's kind of two responses, and I think Rick will get to this a little bit when he gets to his spot around how do we just build meaningful practices in our classroom so we don't have to go to the deeper level of the teeth with the accountability. But a lot of schools will what we've learned is if you don't at least share somewhat of equal value between those two, then people will see one as less than the other. So for example, and again, schools do this in different ways. Rick might push back on this a little bit. But schools will say, you know what, if you're going to be involved in co-curriculars within our building, we're going to hold you to the same expectation of those learner behaviors as we do of the academic outcomes. So I think most academic, like, sports policies, co-curricular policies have some type of minimal expectation for you to be eligible for those things. Well, instead of just doing that on the academic side, they're going to hold them accountable on the learner behaviors. And I would say that we've seen that's been successful. We've also seen some schools that we work with say we're not touching that with a 10-foot pole. Like, it's just, there's two different schools of thought. From our lens, we tend to think of being in co-curriculars as that's a privilege, right? That's, you're representing us. So we want to make sure you have those opportunities to represent our school in those scenarios in the highest manner, which means those are skills they're working on. The second piece that I will add to that, though, Don, is because everybody goes straight to, and this is the number one thing, and I'm glad that Rick's going to get to talk to this in a second, is we go straight to, all right, great, we've got that now into co-curricular codes or whatever. What about the kids that aren't involved? What about the kids that aren't in a sport, aren't in band, aren't in forensics, all those things? And we go to this group of students, and every group kind of puts that group of students in the same thing, like the ones that they say are really disengaged from school. And the number one question that I know Becky says, I've heard you, Don, say it, and I'm pretty sure Rick would be in agreement on it, what do we currently do? Because the reality is you have those scenarios going on right now with kids that are disengaged in the schooling process. So it's not like all of a sudden, because we separated academics from behaviors, now we have kids that are no longer engaged in the schooling process. So the first question I ask is, what do you currently do? The second question is, now you have a lot more meaningful data points and communication on where kids are. What is your systems approach? How do you actually create a system to be able to, the most importantly piece, teach these things, support these things, help them be more successful in them? So there's kind of two layers to that, Don, which is the first one that we tend to see schools do is kind of look at what are some things that we hold our kids to the highest expectation to, and we kind of look at those two as equal, academics and behaviors. But more importantly is, how do we begin to look at how do we provide more structured supports for it? And I always say, and it's weird, and I want Rick to get to this too, is we always go to in these changes and the pushback of the few students that are the situations, we go to the worst case scenario always, and we don't actually see all of the good that's coming out of it in other ways.
I don't know, Rick or Becky wants to go next, but I'll just say one thing briefly. The reason why I push a little bit more, Garth, is I think the schools that we consistently see that implement a practice and they separate the two, but they don't ever, it's not a systematic part of what they do every day. And it becomes this mystical thing that 4 times a year they report out on. And it's a surprise to the kids as much as it is sometimes the teachers and the parents all at the same time. That's where you see it fail. So I just like how you began to build in more, it's more of a systematic part of the building. I think that's absolutely vital. Because in a lot of the places they did the separation, but it becomes something that no one thinks about until it's time to, I have to give a score to that. So.
And we want them to be accountable to those things. Those are important.
Yes. Rick, you want to jump in and then we'll let Becky go?
Oh, I'm going to ramble a lot. You better let Becky go first.
Okay, Becky, go. Okay.
I think just the big piece, I think, when I think about what schools are doing, what we're seeing in schools is they think about in putting in these accountability measures, or if that is, a concern or a worry that they have. I think it's really important just to say, like, where do you currently have accountability that maybe you still have it, it just looks different than maybe it did previously, right? So before you were holding kids accountable because if it was late, you were saying, I'm taking off 10 points per day. That was your form of accountability, right? Or you were saying, okay, you can't do X, Y, or Z, right? You are going to get a 0 if you don't turn something in on time, or if you plagiarize something, it's an automatic 0, right? That's where we thought there was accountability. And I think it's just really a shift in saying, okay, well, maybe you can't reassess until all of your formative work is completed, right? Not if it was completed later on time, but there was value in doing that work. So I'm going to hold you accountable to doing the work by saying that needs to be done before that actually occurs. Or maybe I'm holding you accountable, right, as Garth was talking about from the lens of that separation of academic and behaviors, and I'm holding you accountable for those things because wherever I'm holding you accountable academically, I also have a tie to hold you accountable from the behavioral standpoint. So I think we do have these systems. I know we do when we transition to standards-based grading. I think we have incredibly high levels of accountability, but it's just maybe not how we defined accountability, even though it really wasn't accountability, like if I look back, but it's how we defined it prior to that transition or that change.
Mm-hmm. Sure. Rick?
Well, people circle around it as accountability. I have to be punitive. That's the only way I do accountability.
Right.
And they forget that discipline comes from disciple, which is teacher-student relationship. It's about learning and maturing. So I'm going to think, what do I need to do so this kid matures and doesn't do these things that are setting him back? I'm not going to do something where I'm going to make it a dire consequence so you never do it, you never forget it. And it's always based on a sense of fear and harm, done. You pay for it. I think separating it out and having positive, negative consequences for reports in those behavior marks just as much as you do in the academic ones, if you do positive, negative consequences, is powerful. I mean, if I achieve and I get proficient or mastery or whatever it might be, I am now granted freedoms, rights, and privileges and credit granted to the achieved that is denied to the not yet achieved. And I get to go on with my life and I get to do all those things, whereas this person is still scrambling around to get there. So it's a steeper mountain to climb. It's not seen as a gift, that, they get an extended timeline or something. They're carrying a burden, and I'm not going to let you escape the burden of your learnings, as we mentioned before. And I think that that's valuable. One of the things I found, at least in my experience, in working with high schools, middle schools, elementary schools on this, is that when there's a separate radar, a separate rendering of those things, like Garth is advocating, students care about them more. And I know that, Don, maybe you were thinking that sometimes they don't. I think they're interested in it. And it also prevents a teacher from falsely or distorting the truth of the grade. So, like, I remember early in my career, I had kids who would get A's on tests, but they were such a jerk in class. It was really uncomfortable. When they were absent, I would lift up the silent prayer of thank you. I can now teach today. I would say that in my head, not out loud. But it was a weak moment, but it was a reality for me. But I wanted them to shape up. So instead of the A, I would give them a C. And it's because your behavior was so bad, which is knowingly falsifying the report, which is a form of lying. And I'm not a liar. I don't have moral authority to do that. And I try to be ethical in all I do. So then I realized, I should give the A for the test, but an F or a D or something for behaves appropriately, meets deadlines and everything else. And suddenly the kids were caring about it because, again, with family, there might have been consequences, good or bad, at home for certain grades and so on. I think that's reasonable. I do think that sports eligibility is a really interesting thing. The denial of certain co-curriculars. If they're supposed to be scouts at the Friday night football game and I deny it, But I do think it's okay to say, look, you are making reasonable academic progress. You're in academic good standing. Now, you might be below grade level, but you are progressing a lot because that's developmentally where you are. So I can claim academic good standing. But I think it's also okay to say, but you also have this behavioral, some schools call them successibilities, whatever you want to call that. By the way, that's from a school in Wisconsin. I know that some of you guys are living. So I think it's okay to say participation is based on your behavior performance too, your commitment to the learning's cause, so to speak. And we have to be very clear. One thing I find is a frustration is that some schools don't define that very well. Right. And it's wildly inconsistent teacher to teacher to teacher, which means there's undue pressure on individual teachers when the game stakes are really high on Friday night or Thursday night or Saturday, whenever it's going to be played. And I think that's really unfair to teachers. And it's ripe for corruption, ripe for not doing the right thing. And so a suggestion that we've used in other schools is that there's some kind of mini committee, 2 or 3 pairs of eyes, not one pair of eyes, that looks at the situation when it's borderline, whether or not somebody's going to be able to participate. And this committee kind of collectively decides in about 20 minutes of, sharing stuff by text or whatever it is, what's going to be our decision here. And it's not just the sole province of one individual teacher pressured by a colleague, parents in the community, business leaders, or administrator who's lost their way and is unduly, which does happen from time to time. It happened to me one time. And it was a Monday before a Friday game. And I said, I'd be glad to work with him. He can go back and we'll do this. We can learn. This will be great. And the principal said, perhaps I'm not making myself clear. What can we do to get these grades where they need to be so he is eligible? That kind of thing. But this could be for robotics or Lego. I mean, it can be competition, anything. Yep. out there. And I think that we have a responsibility to be the living example of how to stick by conviction and ethics and integrity. The grades mean what they say. And I just want to point out, though, again, that I think kids care about it when it gets its own radar. So here's your homework completion grade. And if the kid is getting, 5% completion grade, but he's getting an A in all the tests, that means the homework assignments you were giving really didn't matter that much. There was no functional difference. And frankly, as I've used before, I know at some of the conferences with you all, with First Education Resources, in that situation, who's the slow learner? It is, because you thought it was so pivotal when it was nothing. It was inert. Or the kid gets, a wonderful grades in homework, but bombs the test. It makes you wonder whose homework it is you're actually grading, mom or dad's or some other person's or the kid himself. So I think just having that separate report really helps them mature and do that as you move forward. Anyway, that's my initial response.
I mean, I'm telling you, I've got tons of comments. I know we're down to just a couple of minutes, but Rick, I just want to touch on what are some of the skills you're teaching teachers to be able to, instead of using that grade, to hold them accountable? You talked about some of those executive. How are you helping them be able to coach their students through that? Because I think, like I said, one of the reasons why some schools have the separate behavior grade and nothing happens is because the adults maybe don't feel like they have the skills to support the students in those areas. Yeah. So do you mind just touching on that a little bit?
No, yeah. Well, I remind everybody listening that you have 3 actives. So we don't want to make anybody passive. They're all active, okay? There's proactive. What is your proactive discipline in the class? And that's your developmentally appropriate, your instructional design. Are you actually teaching the way the brain best learns and developmental levels and how to engage kids? That's proactive. But interactive is how you form strong relationships and bonds so they want to do right by you and you want to do right by them. I want kids to live and conduct themselves where they don't want to disappoint me. They want to honor and respect me because I am extending honor and respect for them. They have a seat at learning's table. They have a role in my classroom to play, and I expect them to rise to the occasion. That's that interactive stuff. And reactive is, look, here are our class rules and policies, and here are the consequences for breaking them. And one of the things that happens is teachers tend to get really good at one of them and let the other 2 go, or at least one of them go. So you have great people who are like, here are my rules. We all signed the contract. Good. And here are my consequences, so I have to impose them. And then proactive, they might just go, I'm really good with my lessons, but they really don't have any consequences or rules in the class, and it falls apart. So you have to have all 3 in order to maintain discipline and focus and all this stuff. So when some kid is not motivated, we're going to be doing that. But in the world of executive function, there's all kinds of like organizational elements. There's elements of how do I foster independence so you're not always having to be monitored by me. The more the kids can monitor their own development, the more they invest in that and making it happen. So student-led conferences is one of the prime ways to do that. So I'm the one that collects the examples of evidence of my work. And I'm the one that gives the report to mom or dad or an invited adult if mom or dad can't do that. And I have to explain, here I'm demonstrating this standard, and here's how the evidence demonstrates that. Here's where I need to go next in my learning. When kids are responsible for doing that, like in high school science classes and math classes, it's not just elementary school, but that student-led conference, they have to answer questions like, what decisions did I make that allowed me to get to this level of success or lack thereof? What would I do differently next time I've had to do this all over again? What I learn about myself as a learner? And all of that, rather than passively being told how I am, which makes, again, so easy to make excuses. And well, my coach kept me late, or oh, it was because of this, I couldn't do it, so I'm deflecting. I'm not really owning it. And I got to tell you, every time students get to that point, it becomes about agency, and that goes into efficacy, which is I'm empowered to act upon this stuff. And that's hugely important if you want to develop it. Otherwise, kids are coddled in a way, and they never develop that. But then there's hope for recovery when I do screw up. In other words, redos and retakes. I do think, though, simultaneously, when I do work with schools in grading reform, or in particular helping kids develop these things, we have to have an overt course. Like sometimes, before we ever look at changing grading policies of any sort, we spend an entire year on cognitive psychology principles. How does the brain learn? Because once you know those and you're really vested in them, you see all the parallels with accurate, ethical, equitable grading. It's beautiful. It's just wonderful. Like, oh, now I get why you want me to do this. It's just like, it's wonderful. Pedagogically, it's well supported. But I think we also need to develop this idea of what do we really know in the research about motivation and executive function, and how do I cultivate tenacity and perseverance, self-discipline in a kid who doesn't want to be there?
Right.
And again, teachers lack those tools, so I need to put those tools in their hands. I think another one is you have to develop a sense of how do you develop your creative and intellectual soul, because that atrophies if you've taught the same thing for about 3 or 4 years or more. You tend to go on muscle memory and so on. And we found that cultivating teachers' individual creativity, they're able to problem solve, but they also have empathy for being the first-time learner or something. Instead of being so overly familiar, they don't have empathy with first-time eyes. But when they're out there, and when we do it, I used to be in the committee for my school district, the intellectual life of teachers, and I've written about this in articles and things too. But we say you have to go take a course, learn an instrument, learn online world building, take a Minecraft class, from a 10-year-old. Whatever it might be, we talk about that, but it can't be related to what you teach. It has to be purely for your soul, because you become a problem solver. And so now I want to know, what are 9 different ways I could assess this if I'm chasing evidence rather than the format of the test? The format of the test was getting in the way, so what are some alternative ways I could have kids demonstrate accurately without English language learner, language faculty getting in the way, or learning disabilities getting in the way? You can really honestly share what it is. You can't do that because you can't be creative with what you don't have. So the idea is that let's build that creative side. I also do a lot of training with teachers on what do you do to minimize cheating and plagiarism? What do you do as a constructive response when they do cheat or plagiarize? Mm-hmm. And there's very specific things we do. I think a lot of teachers, unaware, they set up a situation to be very ripe for cheating and plagiarism. And one of those things is almost all cheating and plagiarism, at least at the secondary level, is an impulsive act and done out of panic or fear. Mm-hmm. Not, I feel like my teacher is an advocate. They think my teacher is an adversary.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And I'm panicking in the moment. So what do we do in response to that? What do we do to minimize that? Is really something that has to be taught. So and differentiation. How am I developmentally appropriate? And we go on those ways. And then when the instructional design matches what the kids' needs are, there's no need for them to cheat or do these other things, and they actually rise. It's literally teaching smarter, not harder. You have less stress when you do that. So again, that's a little part of that proactive. So in the world of executive function, it would be taking all these elements of executive function, and I can recommend books to people if they like, or send a few slides when I do my program on that. Peg Dawson is one, Lynn Meltzer is one, Richard Guaret is one. If those names come up in your search engines, look for them. I will tell you that if you're really wanting to get a foot in the door, look at anything about powerful, effective strategies for teaching students who are identified with ADHD, because that's a subset of this executive function. Or you could say executive function issues is a subset of ADHD general problems. And you'll already get a running start with some really good ideas. But there's lots of things we do, like color coding all your supplies. If my gym bag is purple, then anything associated with PE and health class is purple. Purple notebook, purple boxes, purple whatever, purple cards. You could take markers and go down the edge of a paper and create purple stripe. So you know those are all papers that are important to PE. If you have a massive locker or a book bag, I just find the purple tipped. But all my green stuff, that's all my science stuff, because I just lined it there. There are these really incredible practical tips. How do I get you to create a calendar of completion where you do the task analysis and you do a little bit each day, working backwards from when it's all due to all those things like we mentioned as a brief example before. One of the things we find kids who struggle with executive function do not have a sense of time passage. And so I actually do multiple activities, and I say, raise your hand when you think 10 seconds has passed. No, don't look at your phone or your watch or the hourglass, whatever. Just when 10 seconds has passed, and almost all kids raise their hand at 6 or 7 seconds. So they misjudge how long things take. So what's 3 minutes? And some kids who struggle with executive function, 30 seconds has gone by. And they're like, oh my gosh, are you adding more time on there? Because it's got 3 minutes has got to pass. So I need to know how long and predict how long something will take me so I can plan ahead so it doesn't overwhelm me at the last minute. And then I'm falling apart and I'm stressed out and anxious and all those things. There are overt, specific practices that will help kids do that. By the way, don't forget, we have a huge ton of organizing apps like Evernote and things like that online. And if kids are on phones already, before school and after school, not in the classroom.
Yeah.
If they're doing that, then we can have organizing apps that are made available, or kids themselves can actually create their own apps for their own personal organization, which is very easy to do. There's multiple YouTube videos of elementary school children doing it. So I know middle and high school kids can do it as well. That's very, very brief and superficial, but thank you for asking.
I say brief, but you say I'm happy we record this because I think you just dropped a ton of nuggets for folks that are very practical.
Yeah.
And that's what I also say when we talk about accountability. Doesn't matter what system you're using; those are skills our kids need. And so I think that's a really vital moment. So hopefully those who are watching, regardless of whatever your system is, those are things I think we got to slow down and really work with kids. I just want to jump, Garth and Becky, any closing thoughts? We really are at the end of our time.
Well, I just think with that, Rick, as you kind of were talking through that, one of the reasons why we know we jump to kind of the carrot and stick of accountability and grading is because maybe they just don't have those tools or skills that you're talking about. And so the more that we can equip them with that, as you said, being more proactive as a part of this transformational process, I think the more that will mitigate some of the pushback that we receive because they feel more confident in what they're doing in the classroom and they're less reliant on the grade as the form of managing what's taking place in the classroom. So I think everything you just mentioned, Rick, is so important. And a key takeaway, I think, as a reminder for me is equip them on the forefront. It makes it a lot easier for them to understand the change then and why that change can be so meaningful for them.
And also, as Tom Guskey would remind us in his research, the teachers get the psychological reward of seeing the benefit to children and the student outcomes that come as a result, and then they get more excited about the grading changes. They've got to experiment a little bit. So I do this other thing where I build up the capacity for this through what I understand about motivation, executive function, and I'm less stressed. The kids are learning. They're more invested. Wow, now I'm ready to learn more about grading. So prior to, or at least concurrent with, would be a great way to go, just as you described.
Yeah. Becky?
Yeah, I just really loved where you said there's 3 types of active. And that was just a moment for me, like a big takeaway for me of just even approaching that change with teachers and with staff that we work with too, of looking at it through that lens of being proactive versus interactive versus reactive. And I love how you said, like, we get really good at one of those and that's kind of where we focus and that's where that lives. So I love looking at that through the lens of like, how do we get good at all of those 3 actives so we can best support our students and still support ourselves too, right, as educators.
But Rick, I just want to say thank you so much. I think we could have you on here for weeks and weeks and months at a time. So Rick,
please tell us you'll come back and join us on the show again at some point.
I will, but that's very scary. I'm okay doing that. As long as you let me play in the sandbox, I'm ready I'm for everything, every conversation.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much. And to everybody, our next live episode will be on May 7th at a different time, 4 p.m. Eastern. A quick note about a time change there for our next one on May 7th, where we're going to dive going deep into reassessment and talking about reassessment practices and how schools are implementing those. So with that, I just want to say thank you very much. Thank you again, Rick. Thank you, Garth and Becky, and hope everybody has a wonderful night.
Thank you, everyone, for joining.
Thank you.
Thank you.